I wanted to first throw out a question. I saw a theory by a gentleman named Alex Craner, who is an author in the finance sector. He laid out a theory of trying to understand what happened in Syria from Russia's perspective. And what he said, that Russia saw the writing on the wall with Syria and its downfall. And then when it did, it decided that it wasn't going to get itself into a quagmire, but it was going to allow NATO and the rest of the forces so keen on chopping up Syria into bits to have at it. And that would therefore be of some strategic advantage and use to Russia. What do you say about this theory, Brian?
I would say it's partially true. Russia realized that there was nothing that it could do about the collapse of Syria, and so they cut Syria loose. We have to understand that there are serious limits to what Russia, Iran, China, other nations in the multipolar world, they have serious limitations to what they can do. We were just talking before the show, if we wouldn't be seeing this struggle between the US and the multipolar world. If the multipolar world had unlimited power, we would already be living in that multipolar world. There is this struggle taking place with these devastating wars, destroying entire regions because there are serious limits to the multipolar world. It is growing stronger, but it still has serious limits. Each nation that makes it up has limits. People take for granted the amount of power the US has accumulated over the decades, and it was riding on European imperialism, which persisted for centuries. And so we have to understand that there's a certain momentum to what the US is doing. There is a struggle because the limitations of the emerging multipolar world. Russia saw its limitations, recognized them, and reacted to them. To a certain extent, so did Iran. We have to understand this collapse of Syria in that context. Now, I've gone back to the RAND Corporation's 2019 document titled Extending Russia. And if you go to its table of contents, the table of contents talks about the different areas that they are using to apply pressure on Russia. First and foremost, Ukraine. Next on the list was Syria. And then Belarus, the Caucasus region, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and also Central Asia. These were the areas that the US was focusing on. And they're applying pressure along all of these fronts. And so Russia, with its limited resources, needs to prioritize. They're obviously prioritizing in Ukraine. The last thing I will say about this is that we can see that the conflict in Ukraine is a war of attrition and that Russia has the advantage, clearly has the advantage. But where does that leave Russia along these other fronts? And what Syria demonstrates to us is that the margins are very thin, at least for Syria. When Russia is looking at the bigger picture, they also need to make sure they have enough in reserve for contingencies like Syria. And obviously, they do not have enough resources to go around and ensure all of these fronts are secured. So they have to pick and choose which ones they hold on to and which ones they need to cut loose if the conflict expands beyond their control and beyond their ability to deal with it. People have to be realistic and recognize that there are limits to what Russia, China, Iran, and the rest of the multipolar world can do at this point.
Well, everyone right now is saying that Syria is this major victory that almost seems permanent in the sense that it has done so much harm to the axis of resistance to Iran. But a lot of people are also saying to Russia, because for Russia, not only does it have military and naval assets in Syria, but it was a sort of bulwark, one of the few states left in the region that is not just sympathetic to Russia, but sees Russia as a key partner and ally. But at the same time, Brian, I wanted to ask you about the consequences of the fall of Syria, not only for Russia and the axis of resistance, but if you could talk about what could be the consequences long term. We see right now Israel on the move. They're occupying, they're taking territory, Turkey as well. The United States will have some say in this. But what they've done is they've unleashed chaos and hell, it seems like. And I'm curious about your assessment of how Russia might perceive how that would affect the collective West and NATO in the medium and long term.
Yeah, so it's already turning into another Libya. So we saw the U.S. NATO, well, not proxy war, but actual military intervention in Libya in 2011, the collapse of the government. And as soon as the collapse took place, the Western media did their victory lap, and then they pretended Libya didn't exist, because as a nation state, Libya no longer really exists as a functioning nation state. Factions are fighting to this very day. Now, the interesting thing is, in 2011, Russia was in no position to intervene and save Libya. We heard these same arguments. For people that remember, back in 2011, people condemned Russia for not intervening and saving Libya. They literally had no possible way of doing that. They don't have the ability to project military power in that manner, especially if NATO is right there preparing to get involved. And they're just flying across the Mediterranean to strike at Libya. So we can see how that has transformed. Libya is a failed state. Both sides are still waging basically a proxy war inside Libya, and that is what we're going to see inside Syria. These terrorists are the exact same organizations and extremists that the U.S. used to overthrow Libya. As a matter of fact, they literally took them from Libya and transplanted them into Syria via Turkey from 2011 onward. And what they did with Libya was turn it into a NATO terrorist breeding ground. They exported weapons and terrorists across the entire region, North Africa, and then going further south into the African continent. And they used that as a pretext for many years to justify the presence of not just the U.S. military, but the French military. This is how they justified a continuous military presence across Africa. But we could see what that has transformed into. We could see the inroads Russia and China are making across all of Africa, and nations literally evicting U.S. French forces from their countries. And so there has been this pivot, and this is what people need to keep in mind. This is long term. You suffer a loss, and the collapse of Syria is undoubtedly a loss. There's no other way to spin it. It is a serious loss, but you have to think long term. It is one battle amid a much wider war. You have to keep focused on that. If you allow one little loss, this little relative to what is going on all around the globe, and you allow that to dishearten you, to shake your focus and your determination, that is self-destructive. People need to get past that, and they need to focus on, this is the reality, this is what happened, what can we do next? So we see Russia, China working on Africa, liberating Africa essentially from centuries of European domination. And the Middle East has also suffered under Western domination for decades, since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And so this struggle will continue, but it has to change, and it has to change recognizing reality and not kidding ourselves. We cannot kid ourselves about what is happening. We have to understand the real problem so we can devise real solutions.
One of the interesting moves that Russia also made almost at the same time after the fall of Bashar al-Assad was to, according to reports now, Belarus has not rejected these claims that Oreshnik missiles are now in Belarus and can be used by Belarus. But Mr. Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, also said, oh, we also have bigger nukes that are just as effective as the Oreshniks, if not more so. And so I'm curious about this move, Brian, in this context, because the fall of Syria and the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad is certainly part of this broader plan by NATO to try to set a trap for Russia. But Russia is now stationing some of the most powerful weapons in the world on NATO's doorstep. What do you say?
Yes, well, Belarus is one of the fronts the U.S. has concentrated on for years and years and years. As a matter of fact, this 2004 Guardian article that I always refer to, admitting that the U.S. was behind the chaos in Kiev back in 2004, the first major attempt to overthrow the Ukrainian government. Then they admitted that they also attempted regime change in Belarus, successfully in Georgia and Serbia. And so Belarus has been has been part of this conflict for years and years, and Russia is consolidating the defense of Belarus by doing this, by making it almost impossible for the US and its proxies in Europe to do to Belarus what they have just done to Syria and what they have done to Ukraine, precipitating this proxy war there, and what they had done in Georgia in 2003 and are attempting to do again right now as we speak. So that is why they're investing so heavily in Belarus. They do not want anything to happen to Belarus like what just happened in Syria. So they're doubling down. It's easier for them logistically. It's right there next to Russia, and it's important that they hold that. We've heard about NATO staging troops along the border with Belarus. There's all of these threats to overthrow the government in Belarus, using proxy groups to go into Belarus, just as Ukraine was pretending to do before they launched their incursion into Kursk. So these are all considerations people have to keep in mind when looking at what Russia is doing. They're not just waking up one day and deciding to do this. There is a real national security threat Belarus faces, and this is Russia shoring them up.
Indeed. And Brian, comment on the a lot of people are talking about the existential threat of the fall of Syria and Bashar al-Assad to Russia in particular. And I do see these moves, as you said, as a way to fortify Belarus and really its own strategic sphere, not of influence, but it's of sovereignty, of being able to protect itself, because in many ways people are looking at the fall of Syria as this road to Moscow, with the final aim being the overthrow of the Russian government. And so I wanted to ask you about this overall strategy by Russia. Like, how do you understand Russia's long-term significance of this? Because people are saying that Syria isn't Russia's responsibility. However, Russia was invited there to protect Syria's sovereignty at the request of the Syrian government. Now the situation is different, and I'm curious about, how do you see this existential threat to Russia with the fall of Syria, and how Russia will continue to move forward?
Yeah, it absolutely is a threat to Russia itself, an existential threat to Russia itself. And the whole reason Russia got involved in the first place is because if you look at the global map and you look at what the United States, NATO, Europe, all their allies have been doing for decades, is encircling and encroaching upon not just Russia, but also Iran and China. If you look at Eurasia, the collective West is attempting to surround all of it. They target all of these nations along the periphery of Russia, Iran, and China. They attempt to destabilize them, politically capture them, turn them into a united front against these three, I would say, pillars of the multipolar world. And so what Russia was doing in Syria was trying to hold the line there. Now that Syria has collapsed, the line has to fall back. The next big target is obviously Iran. These terrorists are going to be used to go into Iraq, into Lebanon, to consolidate control over Syria, and it's all aimed at Iran. What the collective West is doing, and this is, again, look at the big picture. They're going after Iran. If they can eliminate Iran, now they've isolated Russia and China further. Their goal is to get rid of Russia next, to fully isolate China. This is called defeating an enemy in detail. You isolate different units from each other so they cannot cooperate, and you defeat each one in turn, defeating in detail. This is what the US is trying to do on a global scale against the multipolar world. Understanding it in that sense makes it very clear what is happening, why Russia was involved in the first place, and understanding that Russia, China, Iran, they have to do everything in their power to prevent these nations from being politically captured and then turned against them, because they are ultimately next. It's this is not something the multipolar world can negotiate with the United States. They want dominion over the planet, and they will accept nothing less. And that's very clear. They're not, when they talk about freezing a conflict in Syria or Ukraine, it's just to buy time so that they can regroup and go at it even harder. As we just saw in Syria,
Yes.
the freeze was supposed to be moving towards some sort of resolution. Instead, it was just round two.
Yeah, and Russia must be looking at this very closely because it mirrors the Minsk Accords, the Astana Agreement does in terms of now the results. And so, I'm curious, Brian, do you see Russia, given this roadmap that you just laid out as the overall strategic objective of the unipolar world led by the United States and its allies against Russia moving to China? Do you see Russia stepping in militarily further, not necessarily in Syria, because I do believe that is going to be a very difficult situation for all parties involved in the medium and long term. Short term, we're going to see Israel throwing up the flag and Turkey pounding its chest. But these fighters we've seen it over and over again, what happens with these so-called quote unquote rebels, jihadists, the Takfiris, whatever you want to call them, Salafists. They're not, they roll by the beat of their own drum in the final analysis. But what I wanted to ask you is, given that Iraq is in the next road kind of path to Iran, do you think Russia will step in militarily if the situation ends up getting out of control and we see that path to Moscow, or at least the path to cut off Russia from West Asia, develop further?
It's difficult to tell. I think if Russia could, they would have stopped this all in Syria. And the reality is they couldn't. This is, when we're trying to assess what Russia has at its disposal, there's no way to tell because we don't have access to the Kremlin and their understanding of where their strengths and weaknesses honestly lie. But watching Syria collapse tells us that if this were to continue, if this were to then move into Iraq, what is Russia going to be able to do in Iraq that it wasn't able to do in Syria? It wasn't able to do it in Syria. How is it going to do it in Iraq? And the same problem is presented to Iran. So what I think needs to be done, especially for Iran, they need to consolidate what they have and reassess how they're going to approach this. It honestly doesn't look good. People have to understand, again, Iran has certain strengths. Its ballistic missile arsenal is a huge strength. It poses a real threat to the US and its regional proxies, including Israel, especially Israel. But at the end of the day, it itself is not all powerful. If you've been following this struggle for years and years, you will see that Iran itself, inside its own borders, struggles to maintain stability and order. They've been targeted with sanctions for decades, US-sponsored terrorism for decades. Another document that I always go back to is the 2009 Brookings Institution Which Path to Persia document. In here, they lay out all of these options that not only they could use, but that they have used. We know that they've used against Iran. And so Iran is facing the exact same problem Russia is, as laid out in the Rand Corporation 2019 paper. And China also is facing the exact same problem. It's not just Syria that Iran, Russia, and China were looking at. It's all of these areas, all along their periphery, from Europe all the way to East Asia. So we have to keep that in mind. Russia, obviously, its top priority is Ukraine and along its borders, because it has US-sponsored conflict brewing all along its borders. It has to maintain peace and stability within its borders. We know the US is targeting Russia internally. So I honestly, I don't know what else they can do in the Middle East. They have their two bases there. I don't know for how long. I'm not going to make predictions about that. It could change at any moment. They could have been made some promise by Turkey, Israel, and the US, and then the promise gets pulled out from under them again. We don't know. But I think they're focusing first and foremost on Ukraine and now protecting their borders.
Well, my last question on this particular topic, back to this whole trap theory, is I'm curious about the fact that there may be some calculations here by some of the forces, the powers, the unipolarists seeking to carve up Syria, that Donald Trump is coming in and he's looking to get America out, supposedly rhetorically, out of Syria. So let's just grab everything we can, and then we are kind of the forces allied with the U.S. I'm thinking Turkey and Israel here, that will just be allowed to exist because they can be key U.S. allies. But on the other hand, I'm curious about Russia's perspective here, because for Russia, I think they understand quite well that Syria and really the entirety of the Middle East is a non-negotiable arena for U.S. power projection. So I actually don't agree. I'm curious on what you think. I would say that Russia's probably looking at this like, well, the United States is going to have to pool resources into what's going to happen into Syria. And I'm curious of whether they're considering that might give them some reprieve regarding Ukraine, or even just the overall strategy of moving toward Russia at an accelerated pace.
Well, the problem is what Russia sought to do in Syria, what Iran, what China sought to do in Syria was to build. And the United States, what it sought to do is burn the entire region down. Danny, you remember back October 7th last year, and I warned everybody that that operation was a rolling out the red carpet for Israel to first flatten Gaza and then precipitate a wider regional conflict, to create a permissive environment to basically burn the region to the ground, to reverse all the progress that had been made, repairing relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, getting Syria accepted back into the Arab League. All of these steps toward real progress were targeted by that. And from that point until now, we can see what the final result is. Well, it's not really the final result, because they plan on burning everything down. And so for the United States, yes, they're going to invest resources into the Middle East, but it's always easier to burn everything down than to build it up. This is the advantage the U.S. has, in addition to the huge momentum behind their primacy over the globe. They have the advantage of just wanting to burn. They're not trying to compete with Russia and China and Iran and building things up. Their answer to the Belt and Road Initiative is to just arm terrorists and have them attack the infrastructure and literally burn it down. So this is the problem. This is the problem that the multipolar world faces. They're trying to build something large globally, and the U.S. wants to destroy it. And they're very good at destroying things. That's the one thing the United States these days is still good at, is just burning everything down. So that is the unfortunate part. And I think they have the advantage in that sense. A lot of people in the region, and again, I warned about this last year, people are so blinded by ideology, by hatred, by emotions. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't feel emotions, but you cannot allow your emotions to, I would say, distort your ability to analyze. And you should not allow your emotions to drive your decision making. A lot of people just wanted to see Israel hurt. They wanted to believe Israel was being drawn into a trap, when in reality, the trap was being laid for peace and stability in the region. And now it has been sprung, and we see the results. I hope people learn from this. I provided the same warning in 2011 during the US engineered Arab Spring. People still to this day cope with that obvious realization that the US used it to burn North Africa and the Middle East to the ground. They want to believe that, well, the US co-opted it. No, they engineered it years in advance. If you just look at the evidence, ignore your emotions and look at the evidence, stop trying to rationalize and do real analysis, you will see that was engineered by the US. And they're using the same trap over and over again. They used hatred of the US and Israel as a trap back during the Arab Spring. They portrayed it as an anti-US, anti-Israeli movement. And so people reflexively supported it, when in reality it was a U.S. engineered regional regime change operation. That's why it was successful. And they've done it again, and they will continue doing it until people stop allowing themselves to be drawn into the trap.